Hello world of crazy people out there, my name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games, and in the last video, I talked about some things that can go wrong when you're making your GameMaker game, and in this video, I'm going to talk about more things that can go wrong when you're making your GameMaker game. So unlike in the last video that I made on why your sprites sometimes come out blurry when you make a game in GameMaker, and if you haven't seen that video yet, that is essentially a problem that boils down to just checking a single box in your game preferences and then the problem goes away. When you get the variable not set before reading an error message, or indeed any other error message that takes the general form of this in your GameMaker game, this is going to require a little bit of work on your part to figure out exactly where the error happened, why it happened, and what you can do to fix it. I am going to go through a couple of different examples of common problems that can cause this error message to appear, but the examples I go over in this video are by no means comprehensive. And at the end of the day, whenever you do see this error message, you are going to have to go on a bit of a scavenger hunt to figure out where it's coming from. So that brings us to the contents of the error message itself. So pretty much all error messages that you will see in GameMaker, both this one and other error messages, they will take the same general form. There are possibly some ways, if you break GameMaker in a really weird way, that you might not see this error message and you might see like a Windows crash message or something like that instead. But those are pretty uncommon. And for the most part, whenever you see an ordinary run-of-the-mill error message like this, it's going to take this form. So the first couple of lines at the top are going to tell you exactly what the error is and the specific line of code on which it happened. So in my case, the error happened in the draw event for obj_player. We can see the exact line of code is on line 8 of the draw event, and that is the has hat equals true line. And the exact type of error that we're seeing is that variable obj_player.hasHat has not been set before reading it. And this is probably the most common error message that it's the most common first error message for people to run into because it's really easy to do. Anyway, underneath that, we have one line. This is called the stack trace. This tells you exactly where in your code it happened. And in this specific example, it's not that interesting because the stack trace is only one line long. If you're making a more involved game, which has a lot more different objects and scripts and whatnot that are all running, this stack trace could be fairly long. And I'll get into some more involved examples of that later. But first, let's go and say abort, and we are going to close out of that. We're going to go back to our GameMaker project. If I go to the obj_player draw event, and if I go to line 8, we can see that that is indeed what is on line 8, has hat equals true. And for some reason, what the error that we are seeing means is that this variable has not been defined somewhere for some reason. So, if you've been following along these GameMaker videos so far, intellectually that might strike you as a little bit weird because you probably do remember defining this variable at some point, and you think it probably should be defined. You might also remember that we probably defined it in the create event of obj_player because all of the variables that are in this block of code pertain to various player display properties, and they all should have been defined in the create event. And if I go over to the create event, we can see that the variable does not exist that has been commented out, which means that as far as the game is concerned, when it runs, this code is not real. It's not actually there. And when you comment out a line of code that defines a variable, it logically follows that your game will not be able to actually use that variable later on. And this is a very, very simple example where I'm just going to uncomment that line of code. I'm going to run the game again, and the error message is now going to go away. Now, if I run around, we have our duck character. I can even press the buttons that will put the hat and the staff on, and now the game works again. This can also happen, obviously, if the line of code that defines the variable actually isn't there, and there's all kinds of reasons that could happen. You could have simply forgotten to define a variable, and then your game wouldn't work. You might have deleted something. You might have deleted some lines of code that you thought you didn't need, and then you forgot that you deleted a line of code that was actually still being used elsewhere in the game, and by doing so, you're going to get this error message in some form. Another really common way that this can happen, and if this hasn't happened to you, don't laugh because it probably will happen to you eventually, is let's say that you misspell a variable. So GameMaker is not especially particular about making sure that you have defined variables in, for example, the create event before you try to access them, as evidenced by the fact that this can be a problem in the first place. And it is really common for people to do things like, let's pick on a different variable. Let's say that you try to access sprite_id next staff, and let's say that we misspelled the name of this variable, and it was defined spelled correctly in the create event. And if we try to run this, if I go and try and hit the button that will put that sprite layer on, that will enable that sprite layer of my character, we can see that we are going to get the same error message. So it now says obj player.sprite id next staff not set before reading it. If you're especially quick-witted, you might immediately notice that this variable is simply misspelled. If you're in a hurry, you might not see this immediately. And again, if this has never happened to you, don't laugh, it will happen to you eventually. It is the sort of thing that is easy to not notice if you are in a hurry, and if you're just scanning through your code quickly, and if you don't notice that, for example, you transpose these two letters, or maybe other common spelling errors are things like if you like delete a letter on the end, or accidentally leave out an underscore, or maybe you've forgotten the GameMaker variable names are case sensitive and you try to mix capitalization and lowercase letters in your GameMaker variable names. These are all things that can cause this error to happen. This variable does not exist. When in doubt, if you are in doubt, you can feel free to go and copy and paste your variable names, and that will ensure that they are all spelled the same way. Alright, so now that we've talked about probably the simplest reasons that this error can happen, let's go and talk about a more complicated one. So let's go and I'm going to make myself another object, and this can be, I'm going to call it obj button, and I'm just going to go and assign this obj button a sprite that looks like this, my old player sprite. And I'm just going to go and toss one of these down in the room over here. And I'm going to just go ahead and write a little bit of code in, for example, the player step event. And I'm going to say something like, let's say var button here equals instance place x, y, obj underscore button. And this is going to check to see if there is a button object that is in collision with the player, in contact with the player. And if there is, we are simply going to return a reference to that button. If there isn't, it's going to be a null value. It's going to contain the special value no one. And I can say if instance exists button here to see if this is see if this function actually like returned anything useful. I can say button here dot, what do I want to happen when you touch the button? Let's say that a value like high score goes up, is incremented by 1. So if I were to go and run the game again, and if I were to go and walk into this big old smiley face here, when I try to run this code, we are going to have a slightly different variable not set before reading it error message this time. It is now going to say obj underscore button dot high score not set before reading it. And that is because this would be a case where I'm going to try to access a variable in another object using the dot operator and a reference to that instance. But I have not at any point actually defined a variable named high score in, for example, the create event of this here obj underscore button. And to do that, I can go and say high score equals 0 just to initialize that variable so that it now exists. And if I were to actually run the game now, this would work. We're not going to see any feedback for what that high score value might be. I'm not like drawing it in the corner of the screen or anything like that, but maybe I should. Actually, you know what? Am I still allowed to do this? Can I still say in GameMaker, where was the code? Can I still say window set caption? I can. So this is a function which is just going to set the text that is going to appear in the window caption of like the program border. And this is a function I haven't thought about in probably like 15 years. But if I want to, I can say window set caption button here dot high score, and that is going to allow us to actually see what this value is. Just in the window caption, and we can see that it's going to go up when I stand on the button 60 times a second. Another somewhat common reason that this error can happen is if you forget what the scope of the variable, like what scope the variable belongs to. So in this code here, the high score variable has been defined, and it belongs to the it is an instance variable of obj underscore button. But in this code here, I am erroneously trying to treat it like an instance variable of the obj underscore player object. And the obj underscore player object has no such variable defined for it. And if I do this, the game is going to crash. And the error message is going to look fairly similar to the error message that we saw before. Obj player.high score not set before reading it. If you are somewhat quick-witted, you might think obj player.high score, that doesn't sound right, that variable should belong to another object. And that might cue you into the fact that this should say button here.high score. None of these things that we have talked about so far are especially complicated reasons that this error can happen, but they do all mean that you have to pay attention to what you're doing. And if you just jump to conclusions about what your code is doing without actually reading to see what your code is doing, then you're going to have a bad time. So, let's talk about some slightly more complicated reasons that this error can happen. And I'm going to reformat some of the movement code that I've written in this example to make this work. I'm going to define a variable that is something like var move speed, and that can equal 4. And I'm going to, instead of saying x plus equals 4, x minus equals 4 in each of these movement blocks, I'm going to say x plus equals move speed, x minus equals move speed, y minus equals move speed when you hit the up arrow, and y plus equals move speed when you hit the down arrow. And I'm going to contrive some, I'm going to contrive an example where, let's say that you have a run button, and I can say if keyboard check vk underscore shift, we can say move speed equals like 6, else we can say move speed equals 4, and this is pretty common code to write if you want the player to be able to run when they hit the shift button or something like that. And we can see that when I hit the shift button, I'm going to move faster. If I take my finger off the shift button, I'm going to move slower. In fact, let's make the regular walking speed even slower, just so that there's a much bigger difference. All right, that works. You might have noticed that down in some of the rest of the parts of the code where the move speed variable is accessed, we now have a yellow squiggle under it, and this is going to be a warning that GameMaker's IntelliSense system known as Feather is going to give you, and it is going to tell you that you are attempting to access the local variable move speed outside the scope it was defined in. And this is one of the sorts of things that in GameMaker technically you can get away with, but you probably shouldn't do it. And the reason that you shouldn't do it isn't because it is immediately going to break your code, but because it does make it easier for you to break your code. So what that means in English is that you can kind of think of this variable move speed here as being declared twice. You can think of it as being defined in two separate places. One of them in the indentation level, I suppose if you are coming from like a Python programming background or something. But in the block of code where if you're checking if the player is holding the shift key and that condition passes, if that keyboard check is true, and it's going to be defined a second time in this block of code where that keyboard check does not evaluate true, and then you fall into the else block. And like by using my brain, by looking at this code, I can guarantee you with 100% certainty, but that by the time you move on to the next line of code, this variable is guaranteed to have been defined in one of these two places. And this code here, as it is written, will never cause a problem. However, you really should still pay attention to these warnings, and you should write your code so that these warnings don't appear. You shouldn't write your code to look like this, because even though GameMaker allows this, when you define a variable like this, it will be like promoted in scope to the function or to the block of code which is running it. This is the kind of code where errors can sneak in. If you, for example, come back to this code a week later and you forget exactly what you were doing when you wrote it the first time. So let's imagine that it's a week after I wrote this code the first time, and instead of saying else here, let's say that I want the player to hold the control key and go into sneak mode. And instead of like using the regular walking or the fast running speed, this is going to cause us to like to move slower or something. I can say else if keyboard check vk control, then we can say our move speed equals 1. Now when I run the game, I'm going to have never actually declared that regular move speed variable.
Hey.
And if I try to move, so if I hit the up or down or left or right key on the keyboard, then all of a sudden, local variable move speed not set before reading it. Now, why is that? I obviously did declare it. I, in fact, declared it twice. But this block of code has the possibility of, or I should say both of these blocks of code which can define the variable have the possibility that they will never run, and that this variable will never be defined. And if, if it transpires that the player is not holding the control key and the player is also not holding the shift key, then if I try to access the variable later, then it's actually not going to exist and we will get that error. And this is probably not as common as simply misspelling a variable or simply accidentally deleting a variable or not declaring it in the correct object's create event or anything like that. But this is still a fairly common reason why this error message can happen. And to combat this, what you really should do is you should, before you go into this big conditional check to see if the player is running or sneaking or whatever, what you really should do is define move speed here, and you should define that to your default value, for example, 3. And now when I run the game, we are going to have, instead of the game crashing when I walk around, I'm going to be walking around with a move speed of 3. If I hold shift, I'm going to speed up. If I hold control, I'm going to slow down. Very sneaky duck. And the game is going to work. So now the yellow squiggles underneath the x plus equals move speed, x minus equals move speed, etc. Those yellow squiggles have gone away. Two new yellow squiggles have appeared over here. And this is telling us that we are trying to basically redefine a variable which has already been defined. Again, this is something that will work. This is something that will not break your game in and of itself. But it is a yellow warning because it can be a sign that you made a mistake and you didn't notice it. And it just happens to be a mistake that you, by sheer coincidence, can get away with without anything bad happening. But it can also end up being a mistake where, if you're not as lucky, it can actually break your game in other situations. And again, the GameMaker vibe in the community is that you can ignore those yellow squiggles. You really shouldn't, because they are there for a reason, and there are other mistakes that are possible to make that I won't be getting into here that can arise from redefining variables like that multiple times and ignoring the yellow warning. Anyway.
Hey.
The last thing I'd like to do, I think, is go into a little bit more about the call stack that appears at the bottom of the error message when you see one. So I've been working out of just regular object events in the obj_player object so far, which means that all the call stack has to say is basically reiterating that it's gonna be an error at like line 13 in the player step event or something like that. And I don't believe I've actually talked about defining functions in this video series yet, and I might be jumping the gun on this a little bit. I should probably talk about this soon, honestly. I'm going to create myself a script, and I'm going to call the script some function or another, and that's going to define a function for us and we can run it. And let me just define another variable which definitely does not exist anywhere. Some variable which definitely does not exist anywhere. And I can like plus equal this by like 10 or something like that. We are going to access this variable. This variable definitely does not exist anywhere, so calling this function will cause an error to appear. I'm going to go into the player step event. I think I will say, let's say if you keyboard check VK tab or something like that. So when we hit the tab key, we can call this function like this. And when I hit the tab key now, the game is going to crash, and we can see that there is a second line that now this is like, alright, I probably should have picked like less stupid and more concise names so that they don't flow out of the text of the error window. But anyway, we can see that now when I've done this, there are two lines in the call stack at the bottom. On the bottom, you have obj_player step 0, some function or another, and then above that, we can see that it's going to blame some function or another line 2. And that is going to tell us that this is the stack trace, and you can indeed sort of trace through the exact location of the program where it crashed, starting from the bottom and ascending from there. So obj player step event, that's this event over. I didn't mean to close that. That's this event over here. And if you go to line 10 in the step event, that is going to be this line here, which is calling the function some function or another. And if I were to go and go into the code file where this is defined, some function or another, line 2, this is where the error actually happened. And if you have a larger, more complex game, there might or might not be more intermediate function calls or object events in the middle there, which you have to trace the location of the error message through in order to find out exactly where it happened. Alright, so Like I said at the beginning, this is not the only ways that it is possible to make this error message appear. There are other ways that it is possible to make this error message appear, but these are probably the most common ways that you're going to see it, at least when you're just starting out. And I think I'm going to end this off here. So, I might make videos on other specific error messages in the future, but I specifically wanted to do this one because, like I said, it is probably the most common one to see, especially when you're just starting out. But we'll see. So, until next time, my name is Michael. I like Wizards and Dragons and making games. I like to post videos on all kinds of other stuff you can do in GameMaker, so if you're interested in anything like this, feel free to subscribe. I have a Patreon, so if you'd like to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found in all the usual places as well, and if you felt like pledging, I definitely would appreciate it. You should all go check out Wizarducks and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. I hope you all found this useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Zach Robinson, Squarecrow, Spy Games, Pixelated Pope, Paradox, Nykotic, Manta Ray, GameMaker, GameArt Indie, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, Bokeh Dev, and Argo the Knot for supporting these videos. If you want to join their ranks and contribute to the channel, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.